There is frequently this misunderstanding, especially in the West, that Islam has some sort of closer connection to the Old Testament than Christianity due to its strict practices and rituals that appear to many to mimic Old Testament practices. However, this misunderstanding is mainly rooted in the average Westerner's view of religion rather than a comparison of religious practices themselves. The average Muslim views religion not just as a vague moral guideline, but also a guideline for proper practice. Religion governs Islamic society, covering many aspects like hygiene, attire, and sexual behavior. There are also different sets of rules between believers and unbelievers. Such concepts have become foreign to the average Westerner today, who is often more equipped with a universalist mindset. The idea of religion governing everyday practices is frightening to the Westerner, who believes there is some sort of universal practice disconnect from religion that should apply to everybody, and they would never consider the idea of applying rules differently between believers and non-believers, even in a so-called Christian context. This is why Westerners are often awed when they see Muslims and their view on religion. This combined with their frequent Marcionite view of the Bible, as well as their ignorance of traditional Christian practice, is why they will often associate Islamic practice with the Old Testament. But strict practice or adherence to a religion does not necessarily mean it has a connection to the Old Testament. I will demonstrate how Islam has no adherence to Old Testament practice whatsoever, and that it is actually orthodoxy that not only adheres to, but is the one true continuation of the Old Testament religion itself. The first thing that will often come to mind is Islam's argument of recognizing all the prophets of the Old Testament. However, this is a vain argument, as even many pagan nations during those times also recognized the prophets to be from God. And by that same logic, must we also call Hindus who recognize the divinity of Christ as being Christians? It is insufficient to say you recognize the prophets. You must also accept the teachings and commandments handed down by God through them. For example, even during and after the New Testament period, Christians have followed the law of Moses as a moral guideline. In the 6th century, the Roman Emperor Justinian made an overhaul of the Roman law in his new codex, the Codex of Justinian, which was heavily influenced by the law of Moses to allow Christian society in the empire to be governed according to the morality of the Old Testament. In contrast, we see no such case in Islamic civilizations where their laws were influenced by Mosaic law. Instead, we see Sharia law, which is completely disconnected from the Old Testament and influenced only by the Quran, not the Torah or any other books in the Old Testament. What about the abstinence from pork in Islam, one might ask? Isn't that found in the Old Testament? While it is true that God commands the children of Israel to abstain from pork, as it is called unclean, this commandment is completely misunderstood in Islam, with this misunderstanding being inherited from Rabbinic Judaism, another religion that has divorced itself from the original interpretation of the Old Testament. The Mosaic Law does not teach that there is anything theologically impure about unclean animals themselves. The term unclean is to designate that the flesh of such animals is not to be consumed, not that there is something intrinsically wrong with these animals. If there was, why would God command Noah to save the unclean animals in the flood? You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female, also 7 each of birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. This makes the obsession of avoiding any contact or consumption of swine at all costs by Muslims irrational and unscriptural altogether. The law of avoiding eating unclean animals was given for hygienic reasons and for people to eat properly in a civilized manner, nothing more. As for circumcision, Islam completely misses the whole point of this covenant God gave to the prophet Abraham altogether. Circumcision was given exclusively to the children of Israel to distinguish themselves from neighboring pagan nations, as they were the children of God living in God's nation. Even Muslims explicitly admit to not being the children of Israel, so then one must question why every Muslim nation adheres to this practice. It is just another vain ritual Islam borrowed from the rabbinics, completely disconnected from its original meaning. Moving on to practicing worship itself, Islam has no resemblance to Old Testament worship at all. In the Old Testament, we see the temple in Jerusalem and synagogues followed a very specific structure and layout. You had the Holy of Holies, where only the priest was permitted to enter, which had the altar and tabernacle located inside it. Incense was always used by priests during worship. No such practices exist during an Islamic worship. Their mosques do not resemble the Old Testament temple structure at all. It is only Christianity and the apostolic traditions, like Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, and traditional Catholicism, where this practice can still be found. An Orthodox church will include the sanctuary, which mimics the temple's Holy of Holies, and also includes the altar and tabernacle. Incense is still used to this day during an Orthodox liturgy. The Gospel is read during a liturgy in the same manner the Torah was read in the temple and synagogues. And chants still follow the same style and format as the Old Testament. Islamic worship does not even get close to mimicking these practices, which is further vindication that it does not have its roots in Abrahamic practice. Islam also does not possess a hierarchical priesthood that was seen in ancient Israel in the Old Testament. It is instead led by sheikhs and imams that do not follow some sort of concrete hierarchy or any form of organized structure. This is arguably why there are so many sects in Islam, because they just continuously develop their own doctrines and theology based on their own interpretations of their Quran, rather than following an organized system of ecclesiastical authority. Islam is also missing extremely fundamental theology from the Old Testament. In the Torah, it is very clear what the punishment for sin is. Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. Islam does not follow this strict practice of putting sinners to death. Their Sharia law is comparatively lighter when it comes to punishments. Even for larger crimes like theft, it will only result in cutting off someone's hand rather than putting them to death. The Torah is quite clear though. If you commit a sin, you must die, or something else must die in your place. This is called an atonement sacrifice, where an animal receives the punishment of death in your place. Islam has no such practice. Nothing atones for your sins in Islam. In contrast, the Israelites frequently made animal sacrifices to atone for their sins in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, God made the ultimate sacrifice by sending his Son to be crucified on our behalf. The next day John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The next topic I'd like to discuss is the God of Islam, which possesses characteristics that do not exist in the God of the Old Testament. It is clear that the Islamic God is heavily influenced by Neoplatonic ideas, like being incapable of dwelling inside creation at a single point in space and time. This is contrary to the God of the Bible, who does frequently dwell in points in space, like when he dwells on top of the Ark of the Covenant surrounded by cherubim in the temple. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim, which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel. Further proof of Islam's Neoplatonism is the belief that it is impossible for divinity to make contact with material creation, as seen in their rejection of the hypostatic union, in which God united to himself a human nature and substantially became man, making his humanity one with his divinity. In the Islamic paradigm, Allah is beyond creation and cannot subsist inside of it, a characteristic identical to that of the Neoplatonic God. This is why Muslims are baffled by the idea of God becoming man. It's simply because they don't believe in the God of the prophets, but rather in the God of Greek philosophers. While we're on the topic of Neoplatonism, I'd like to bring up the issue of Islam's view of the soul. The traditional understanding in Islam is that the soul pre-exists creation and then is placed inside the human body at conception. This is another view borrowed from Platonism and is contrary to what is taught in traditional Christianity and the Bible, which is that the soul is created at conception and in no case exists before it. The Platonic idea of the pre-existent soul is taught nowhere in the Old Testament and is merely a consequence of the belief in dualism, which seeks to divide the soul from the flesh and place identity on the soul alone. The Old Testament, however, makes very clear references that oppose dualism. "Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Try my kidneys and my heart." This verse makes clear the ancient Israelites' view of the self by placing emphasis on body organs like kidneys and the heart, and in this context heart is referring to the organ, not a subcomponent of the soul. We can see that identity is placed on both the soul and the flesh without dividing them. Islam places identity on the soul alone. This is also why they don't believe in the resurrection. They instead believe when you die that your soul leaves your body forever and is returned to Allah to live eternally in Jannah. Contrary to what many in the West believe today, this is not what the Bible teaches. In the Old Testament, when a person died, their soul wouldn't go to heaven or hell, but rather to death itself. "His breath goeth forth, he returneth to his earth. In that very day his thoughts perish." In this verse it is quite clear what the Israelites believed happened when you died. Your thoughts, in other words your consciousness, perished. This is why death is a great tragedy in Christianity. It is the most outrageous enemy to life itself. That is why the resurrection of the dead is heavily emphasized in the New Testament. Christ came to destroy death itself and fulfill the resurrection. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live." In other words, it's not heaven that is the final goal. Heaven is just a temporary state our souls exist in post the resurrection of Christ. It is the resurrection itself that is the final goal, in which our souls will be reunited with our bodies during the second coming of Christ, where we will return back to our whole state again in a single soul-body composition. You can try to argue the resurrection is an exclusive view to the New Testament. Indeed, there were different sects among the first century Jews that debated about this, particularly whether or not there would be a resurrection. But they all agreed on a unanimous interpretation of the Old Testament that after you died, your soul also died. None of them believed in the idea of a soul breaking free from the bonds of their created bodies and returning to God in the uncreated order. This idea does not stem from Old Testament religion, but rather from Platonism. There is a lot more I could talk about in this video refuting Islam as being a so-called Abrahamic religion, but I wanted to keep this short and concise. Bottom line is, it's not sufficient for Islam to claim it recognizes our prophets to call itself Abrahamic. It needs to possess an actual continuation of Old Testament theology, law, and practices as conveyed by the prophets.